A shy florist who never dared to meet a customer's eyes. One rainy night, with trembling hands, she saved an entire $1 million gala, unaware that the man she helped was a lost millionaire, drowning quietly beneath his own spotlight. And, from a single whisper backstage, came a proposal beneath the garden she had built by hand, because sometimes the person who changes your whole life enters with a gentleness no one ever noticed. Each morning, the tiny flower shop on Edgewood Street carried the scent of fresh carnations. Sunlight filtered through the dusty front window, casting a warm golden glow across the white lilies just beginning to bloom. In that room of petals and perfume, Lila stood behind the counter, thin gloves on, quietly trimming the thorns from a rose stem with a florist's blade. The only sound in the shop was the soft hiss of tape as she fastened the base of a bouquet. No background music, no bright chatter. Lila wasn't good with words, and she knew it. Instead of trying to be charming, she let the flowers speak for her. People often said her arrangements felt like something, like emotion, like memory. Perhaps because she poured herself into every stem, every bloom. Outside, Atlanta was already buzzing. Monday was always loud, but Lila didn't notice until the doorbell chimed. An older woman stepped in. Black dress, black sunglasses, lips pressed in a firm line. Her perfume arrived before she did, sharp and expensive. She glanced around, her gaze unapologetically critical. "You do the flowers here." Her voice was as thin and sharp as a blade. Lila nodded softly. "Yes, I'm Lila. I need an arrangement. Funeral, my mother. Next week. I want it elegant. No fluff. White roses. No baby's breath. And for God's sake, no silly ribbon tricks." Lila tried a gentle smile. "Of course, would you like to, no questions, just make it beautiful." My mother hated anything mediocre. She left a business card on the counter and turned sharply, heels clicking, gone as quickly as she came. Lila stared after her, then exhaled, quietly retreating behind the counter. Her hands were trembling. As she knelt to gather a few fallen stems, a gust of wind pushed open the side door. The sheer white curtain fluttered high, brushing against her arms, sending the bouquet in her hands tumbling. Roses spilled to the ground. Water splashed across the wooden floor. Lila froze. Her face paled. She stared at the scattered blooms like she'd broken something sacred. Slowly, she bent down, hands trembling as she picked up the fallen petals. A soft sound from the doorway. Someone had entered. He wore a crisp white shirt, dark trousers, and his hair, neatly trimmed, caught the light as he stepped forward. Tall. Calm. His gaze swept over the scene, the bouquet on the floor, the young woman crouched among petals, the curtain still billowing like breath. He said nothing. Lila looked up, her eyes catching his. She stood abruptly, hiding her hands behind her, back as though the moment could still be undone. "I'm sorry, Holtso. I'll clean this up right away." He nodded slightly, not moving closer. His gaze lingered on her hands, wet fingers cradling a crushed white rose. "It's all right. I'm actually here to order flowers for a gala." Lila blinked. "A gala." He smiled just a little. "A charity event for orphans. We'll need floral arrangements for the stage, the tables, the entrance. Can you do it?" She hesitated. It was a large order, far bigger than what her little shop usually handled. But more than that, it was the fear of speaking, of failing, of disappointing. And yet his eyes didn't rush her. They didn't judge. They just waited. I can try," she said, her voice soft but certain. His smile deepened, gentler now. He reached into his pocket and handed her a business card. "I'm Ethan. My assistant will send you the details. And thank you." He left as quietly as he'd come. Lila stood still, the ruined rose petal still in her hand. Something warm stirred in her chest, a small, unfamiliar brightness that seemed to lift the entire room. That night, she stayed late. She went through every flower sample, sketched arrangements on the backs of old receipts, checked her inbox more than once, waiting for Ethan's email. She didn't know why, but she wanted to do this right. Not for the business, for herself. On the corner of her desk, she pressed the fallen rose petal into her notebook. For the first time, a tiny moment of failure had become the quiet beginning of something entirely new. That afternoon, the sky over Atlanta hung heavy and grey, clouds sagging low above the roof of the little flower shop on Edgewood. Inside, Lila stood silently behind the counter, reviewing her checklist one final time. Tomorrow morning was the gala, the first major event she had ever handled, the biggest order she'd ever dared to say yes to. And though the weight of it pressed into her chest, she swallowed it all down, leaving only the stillness of her hands, placing each flower like she was arranging a small universe of her own making. The phone rang. The screen read, "Greenbloom Supplier." Her heart skipped. "Lila, it's Ruby from Greenbloom." The voice on the other end trembled. I'm so sorry, but something's happened." Lila sat down. "The delivery truck. There was an accident on the highway. Most of your order, it's damaged. We can't get the flowers to you in time." Everything stopped. Lila couldn't hear anything. The air around her blurred into silence. The image of the gala, the lights, the tables, the delicate centerpieces she'd imagined for weeks, collapsed in her mind like a paper tower soaked through with rain. She bent forward, hands gripping her head. Her heart hurt, not just from disappointment, but from something deeper. This wasn't just an order, it was trust. Ethan had believed in her, and now she was about to become a broken promise. She wanted to cry, but instead, she stood. Not with resolve, but with the quiet instinct that if she didn't act now, nothing would change. Lila opened her laptop and pulled up an old spreadsheet, a list of small local farms she had compiled years ago, back when she was still a student. She started calling, one by one. "Hi, this is Lila. I need flowers. Urgently, I can pick them up myself. No, it doesn't have to be perfect. Anything fresh. I'll redesign the entire thing." Many said no. "We're out. It's too wet to harvest. No driver today." But Lila didn't give up. Finally, someone said, "If you can get here, I've got some chrysanthemums left. But it's pouring." She looked outside. Rain was already pounding against the windows, blurring the street into watercolor. She grabbed her coat, a basket, her keys. No one offered to come with her. She didn't ask. The old car rattled to life, its wipers struggling against the downpour. Her hands were damp on the wheel, knuckles white. The roads to the outskirts were muddy and slick. The car jolted. With every pothole, every sudden break rattled its frame. The first stop, a tiny farm with bundles of deep purple mums. Not what she'd planned, but still alive. She bowed in thanks, placing them in the trunk like treasure. Second, a lavender farm. The owner handed her a bundle, then touched her arm gently. "Believe it'll be enough, sweetheart." Each stop was a battle, with time, with weather, with the ache in her chest. But each armful of flowers was a win, not huge, not dramatic, but real. The final stop had white roses, exactly the type she'd imagined for the centerpieces. But as she climbed into the car, fumbling in the rain, the bouquet slipped from her arms. It hit the edge of the seat, stems bent, petals torn. She sat there, rain dripping from her hair, the ruined roses in her lap like proof she hadn't done enough. Her first tear fell not from fatigue but from heartbreak. She had done everything, and still it might not be enough. But then she saw Ethan's face in her mind. The way he'd looked at her when he said, "You saved the gala." That quiet trust. And she saw herself, not the girl who once avoided eye contact behind the counter. The girl who was now, alone in the rain, fighting to keep her promise. She reached into her bag for scissors and tape. One by one, she trimmed the damaged petals, reshaped them, replaced them with soft leaves folded and pinned in place. Each repair a vow that she would not let failure define what had started in faith. By the time she returned to the shop, the clock read 2 p.m. She didn't change clothes, didn't rest. She switched on the lights, laid each flower across the floor and got to work. Her hands were shaking, cold but steady. lavender beside white rose, green from the young dahlias tucked between purple mums. It wasn't the original design. It was something more honest. By sunrise, the final bouquet was secured in its box. Lila wiped her forehead, tied her hair back, and looked around the room, filled not with perfection but with everything she had gathered, from sheer determination, from belief, from a sliver of courage in the storm. She smiled. She had never felt stronger than she did in that moment. That morning, the Atlanta sky was an impossible blue, clear and bright as if trying to make amends for the long, storm-soaked night before. The air smelled of damp earth and blossoms, carried on a breeze that wound around the small delivery. Trucks parked outside a grand hotel, the site of the charity gala. Lila stepped down from her van, fingers clutching a clipboard with floral placements and stage diagrams. She wore a simple white blouse, her hair pinned neatly into a bun. Her eyes were shadowed from sleeplessness, but they gleamed with quiet resolve in the morning sun. While hotel staff bustled to arrange tables, Lila was already at work, placing each arrangement with a precision that lived entirely in her mind. One by one, she dressed the stage, the dining tables, the grand entry, her hands moving with the grace of someone who knew beauty didn't need to announce itself. No one asked who she was. She moved invisibly like she belonged, yet something in the way she positioned each flower, tender, exact, reverent, caused more than a few to pause and watch. She didn't see the man watching her from the second floor, behind a fogged pane of glass. Ethan had just arrived prepping for the gala's opening speech. A staffer handed him a typed script, bold-fonted, polished, hollow. He skimmed it once, then set it down. His jaw tensed. In the mirror's reflection, he saw a man about to be celebrated and feeling utterly disconnected from the cause that had once lit something inside him. He descended into the ballroom, past the hum of lights being tested, past the rows of untouched seats. A spotlight swept across the stage, washing him in cold white glare. He paused in it, his silhouette stretched long and alone across the floor. "I don't want to give this speech," he said quietly to his assistant. "But it's been approved," she replied. "Media will be present. You just need to—" "No, it's not me. It's a statement. A press release. But I want them to remember the children, not my name." He turned to leave the stage when a voice spoke from the shadows, soft but certain. "Then why don't you just say that?" He turned. There she was, half hidden in the still-covered audience section, hands still speckled with glue and crushed petals. Lila. "I'm not good at speeches," he confessed, almost sheepish. "Every time I stand in front of people, all I can think about is not messing up." Lila smiled gently. "I'm better with flowers than people, but I've learned, when you speak with your heart, it carries like a fragrance. You don't have to see it to feel it." A beat of silence. Ethan nodded. "Thank you." "Lila," she offered. He repeated it softer. "Thank you, Lila. It happened in just a few minutes. No one else noticed. But for Ethan, it was the moment everything shifted." That evening, the gala began. Lights beamed onto the stage. Applause rose as Ethan stepped into it, the speech still folded in his hand, but he didn't look down at it. Instead, he looked toward the front row, toward Lila, half hidden in the wings, standing still beside a towering bouquet. He began with a story, not a mission statement, not a line from the press team, but a boy named Manny, an orphan he'd once met who wanted nothing more than to hold a teddy bear at night. He spoke in his own voice, plain, honest. The room fell into a hush. Eyes welled. Lila watched. From behind the curtain, half his face was lit by the spotlight, the other left in shadow. Their eyes met just for a second, and in that second, both of them knew. This wasn't a small moment. It was the beginning of something real, not built on eloquence or perfection, but on truth. If you were Lila, standing at the edge of light with fear wrapped around your ribs, would you step forward? Or would you turn away, pretending you were never there? Leave a quiet truth. In the comments, because maybe the story you've been hiding is exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The wind chimes above the flower shop door tinkled softly in the morning sun. Lila was changing the water for a cluster of pale blue hydrangeas, slowly turning the vase, her head bowed as always. When she heard the bell above the door ring, she didn't look up, just murmured, voice light as breath, "Good morning, Guy." No reply came. A pause followed, just long enough to make her glance up. There he was, Ethan, standing just inside the door, dressed simply in a light grey sweater, looking nothing like the man from the elegant gala, yet unmistakably him. His gaze held that same quiet attentiveness. Lila blinked. Her fingers instinctively tightened around the towel in her hand. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice dropping a little lower. Ethan smiled, nodding. "I'd like to order a bouquet, like the one you made for the gala." Lila turned away, not answering. A sudden warmth spread across her cheeks. Not embarrassment, but something closer to dread. Did he remember her? Or was he just here to offer polite thanks? "You made that night something else," he said, as though he'd read the hesitation in her eyes. "That speech, and I've never seen so many people cry." Lila didn't turn. She bent a little further, pretending to arrange the flowers again. But every word landed in her chest, like a small echo. "Thank you for the advice. And for the flowers, they said what I couldn't." Her grip tightened. Part of her wanted to turn around, to speak, to say something, anything. But the other part, the one shaped by years of quiet corners, held her still. She disappeared into the back cooler, leaving Ethan at the counter. But through the narrow crack of the door, she could still hear his voice, low, respectful, as he spoke to Frank, the old florist who had taught her more than any book ever had. "You're the owner?" Ethan asked. Frank chuckled. "Not really. I just keep the seat warm for the one who actually knows what she's doing. She's the one who arranged the gala flowers." "That's right. Lila. She's not one for the spotlight, but she's got a rare eyes and her hands nobody arranges quite like her." A pause. Then Ethan spoke, softly, almost to himself. "It's strange that someone who can create something so beautiful would always choose to stay backstage." Frank lifted his teacup. "The best ones usually don't know they're the best. They just keep doing the work, like music that doesn't need an audience." At the front, Ethan placed his order. Cream roses mixed with hydrangeas and a few delicate sprigs of orchid, just like the centerpiece at the gala. He paid, then turned before leaving, raising his voice just enough to carry through the door. "I'll be back, and if she has a moment, I'd like to say thank you, in person." The door shut gently behind him. Lila stepped out a moment. Later, her eyes falling to the bouquet order now resting on the counter, her fingers brushed a single orchid petal, tender and slow. A smile flickered across her lips, not from surprise, but from the soft bloom of something just beginning. Behind the curtain, she was no longer a shadow. She was becoming part of the world he was starting to reach for, bit by bit. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a quiet tremble in the chest, just enough to let her know someone was truly seeing her. Afternoon light faded slowly through the time-worn glass of Edgewood flowers. Outside, the sun stretched thin across the cobbled sidewalk, paling beneath the shadows of trees dancing in the spring breeze. Inside, the scent of blooms drifted gently between the quiet snips of scissors and the soft rustle of tissue paper, a silence so still it felt sacred. Lila was arranging a bouquet of pale purple hydrangeas and white orchids, her head tilted slightly, gaze soft and focused. The shop was empty, her favorite time of day. No interruptions, just her and the flowers inside a wordless world of her own making. Then the bell above the door chimed. Lila looked up. Ethan stepped in, his usual composed presence carrying a subtle difference. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair slightly tousled, and his eyes, those deep, steady eyes, held something unspoken. Fatigue, maybe, or something more fragile. "Here, 4 flowers?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He nodded. "The same as always." Then, after a pause, added quietly, "But I didn't just come for flowers today." Lila stilled. Her eyes met his, not questioning, not impatient, simply waiting. That quietness in her, that rare ability to make space, drew Ethan forward. He sat in the chair by the window, where the afternoon light always pooled. She didn't sit across from him. She brought 2 cups of rose tea, set them down gently, and said nothing. And somehow, it was the silence, the kind that didn't ask, didn't prod, that opened something Ethan rarely touched. No one had ever asked, but no one had ever made him want to tell. "There was a boy," he began, voice low. 8 years old. Lived in a marble house with polished wood floors and spiral staircases, and no one remembered his birthday. Lila rested her hand on the edge of the chair, her eyes never leaving him. He made his own card with markers, wrote "Happy Birthday" to me, and left it on the dining table. Ethan gave a hollow laugh. His mother saw it, frowned, told the housekeeper to throw it out, and said it was an eyesore. For a moment Lila saw him, not the man in front of her, but the boy he once was. Sitting alone at a long, gleaming table with a handmade card, colorful, messy, desperate for someone to see him. My father was always in New York. Board meetings. Every time I tried to speak to him, he stared at his phone. Eventually, I stopped trying. Ethan's eyes drifted toward the window, where sunlight filtered through green leaves. Once I pretended to be sick, stayed in bed all day. My mother gave the maid some cough syrup, told her to mix it with water, didn't ask if I was okay, didn't touch my forehead, just said, "Make sure he doesn't die. It'd be inconvenient." Lila raised her tea, then paused, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She didn't cry, she simply felt. So I grew up believing that if no one would love me, then maybe I could at least do something good. For someone else. He looked at her then, as if expecting her to look away, but Lila met his gaze and asked softly, "Is that why you started the foundation?" Ethan nodded. "First for orphans, then senior homes, scholarships. I've done everything I can to make sure kids like me, and the ones the world forgets, get seen, get heard." She held his gaze for a long moment, then said gently, "Maybe no one really saw you, Ethan. Not until that night at the gala. But they did. I did." He didn't speak. Then, so quietly it felt like confession, he tapped the rim of his cup and murmured, "You're the first person I've ever told this." Lila's heart tightened, not with pain, but with the weight of holding something fragile, a piece of him no one else had touched. "Why me?" she whispered. "Because you listen like what I'm saying matters. You don't try to fix me or pity me, you just stay like a flower." Lila smiled, not because of the compliment, but because she understood. Between them, silence bloomed, full and warm, like a room, filled with fragrance. When Ethan left, he didn't take any flowers, just left behind a folded note beside his untouched tea. It read, "I grew up in a house without flowers. Thank you for showing me they can be the most beautiful memory." Lila read it once, then tucked it gently into a small drawer, where she kept the soft fragments of a life being slowly rewritten. Outside, bougainvillea petals floated past the window in the breeze, and inside, a man had taken one quiet step closer to something he never believed he deserved: healing. Late winter in Atlanta was colder than usual, not because of the wind, but because of the thick, unmoving clouds pressed low over the city. In the small back room of Edgewood Flowers, Lila sat in stillness, the world outside muffled as if wrapped in cotton. It was the room she always retreated to when the world felt too loud. On the desk in front of her lay a single sheet of paper: guest speaker at the 2025 Charity Gala, Lila M. Bennett, owner, Edgewood Flowers. She had read the words at least a dozen times, and each time her chest tightened like someone had tied a ribbon around her ribs and pulled. Her hands trembled. Her throat was dry. She still couldn't believe it. A guest speaker, in front of hundreds of people, on a stage, under lights, with applause, or worse, silence. You'll be the voice representing the connection between art and compassion, the letter had said. Your speech will open the event, a tribute to those behind the beauty of last year's gala. Now, Lila sat in front of the mirror, holding a crumpled scrap of paper. Notes for what? She hoped to say, "Hello, I'm Lila. I'm not great at speaking, but flowers have taught me that." She stopped, couldn't go on. Her lips pressed shut, her fingers tightened, wrinkling the paper. In the mirror, she didn't see a woman ready to inspire anyone. She saw a quiet, unremarkable girl trying to hide from her own reflection. She tried again. "The gala to me is a place," she faltered. Her throat clenched. Her eyes burned. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She turned away, wiping it quickly, as if she wasn't allowed to witness her own fear. She sat there a long time. The only sound was the clock ticking gently on the wall. That evening Ethan stopped by, as he often did now. He didn't come in. He simply left a bouquet at the counter with his assistant. Tucked inside, between soft white orchids, was a small folded note. "You've already touched hearts, the mic just amplifies it." Lila paused when she read it. Once, then again. Her heart clenched, not from nerves but from recognition. Ethan had seen the part of her she was still hiding. The next day, she returned to the mirror. This time, she didn't hold any notes. She simply looked into her own eyes. "Lila, you saved a gala with your hands. Now all you have to do is use your voice," she said it aloud. No stumbles. In the days that followed, she stayed late at the shop, not to arrange flowers, but to rehearse, alone, in front of the mirror, in front of bouquets, in front of the framed photos from past events. Sometimes, she stood behind the wooden floral bench and pretended it was a stage. Her hands shook, so did her knees, but she didn't stop. And each time she placed Ethan's note in front of her, a reminder that her voice didn't have to be perfect. It only had to be true, and truth she had in abundance. One late evening, the rain began to fall. The shop was empty. Lila was speaking the final lines of her practice when the lights flickered, then went out. Darkness settled in. She stood still. Then, in the dark, she kept going. Her voice quiet, steady. When the lights returned, she smiled, a radiant, quiet smile, the kind worn by someone who's just stepped beyond the biggest fear of her life, being seen. The gala was 2 weeks away, but in her heart, the most important thing had already happened. Lila had begun to believe that even a trembling voice could move someone. She touched the bouquet Ethan had sent. The note still carried the faint scent of orchid, and for the first time she thought, maybe what makes someone inspiring isn't a commanding voice or a poised stance. Maybe it's simply the courage to tell your own story, no matter how small, no matter how unsteady, with your whole heart. Soft music drifted through the grand ballroom, where spotlights shimmered over white linen tables, and blooms so perfectly arranged they looked like they might breathe. This year's gala was larger, more guests, more glamour, more noise. But behind the opulence and polished laughter, one heart was beating fast. Not for the spotlight, not for the grandeur, but for something deeply personal that was about to begin. Backstage, behind a velvet curtain, Lila stood clutching a microphone in one hand, a folded sheet of paper in the other. Her handwriting, delicate, slightly shaky, spilled across the page, honest and unvarnished. Her lips moved soundlessly, mouthing the opening lines. Then she exhaled and set the paper down. On stage, the MC spoke, and now we're honored to welcome someone very special, someone whose quiet artistry shaped the beauty of last year's gala, and whose presence continues to inspire us this year. Ms. Lila Bennett, owner of Edgewood Flowers. Applause rose, warm, respectful. Lila stepped into the light. The beam hit her squarely, and for a heartbeat she froze. She wasn't made for stages. She feared eyes. But in the front row, Ethan sat watching her, his gaze steady, soft as candlelight. Beside him rested a bouquet of white orchids, the very first arrangement she had made for the gala a year ago. He had kept it, preserved it, a quiet emblem of where it all began. The mic was cold against her lips. She inhaled and began, not loud, not polished, but clear. "Good evening. I'm Lila. I'm not used to stages. I'm not good with word, but I'm very good at being quiet." A ripple of laughter, gentle, kind. She smiled for the first time on stage. "But I've learned that quiet doesn't mean invisible. We can be soft and still reach others, like a flower that says nothing yet makes people stop and smile and feel something." She paused. Around her, the room seemed to hush itself, holding its breath. "And I think it's okay to shake," she whispered, "as long as you keep blooming." Silence, then suddenly applause. Scattered at first, then swelling, wave after wave. People stood. Some wiped tears. Some just held their hands over their hearts. Lila smiled, not for the applause, but because she had done it. Something she once believed impossible. Not by magic, but by courage. And one person who had believed in her long before she believed in herself. Afterward, she stepped off the stage. Ethan met her wordlessly, took her hand and led her into the garden behind the ballroom, where every flower had been arranged by her own hands. Twinkle lights hung like stars between trees. Hydrangeas, orchids, dahlias shimmered in soft gold light. The air smelled like spring and new beginnings. There, surrounded by beauty she once thought belonged to others, Ethan turned to her. He didn't rush. He didn't speak too soon. He just looked at her, as if trying to memorize a moment he never wanted to end. "Lila," he said gently, "I used to think my heart was too quiet for anyone to hear. Until you walked in, quiet but undeniable." Then he knelt. "No flash, no fanfare, just flowers and faith. You made my world bloom. And if you'll let me, I'd like to spend my life inside that garden. With you." Lila didn't cry, but her eyes shimmered. She nodded and whispered, "Only if you promise to let me arrange flowers on the hard days too. Not just the beautiful one." He laughed. They embraced in the middle of the garden while applause still echoed faintly in the distance. And on that night, on a stage she once feared in a room full of strangers, Lila bloomed, and no one, not even fear, could stop her now. On a late spring morning, a small neighborhood in South Atlanta woke to a joy it had never quite known. Laughter from children echoed from the community park, once just a cracked concrete lot, now bathed in sunlight and overflowing with flowers. Long wooden tables lined the tree-shaded paths, draped in pastel linens, adorned with cakes, floral tea, and tiny potted plants ready to be taken home. At the far end of the park, a freshly painted mural bloomed on the white wall. The garden of us, where every heart is allowed to bloom. Beneath it, Lila stood in a simple white linen dress, her hair braided loosely, a basket of blooms in one hand as she gently guided a group of children in planting flowers. Ethan sat nearby at a table, teaching how to make teddy bears from recycled fabric, surrounded by laughing elders swapping stories about the good old days. There were no cameras, no press, no glittering guests. Just a promise kept, a vow made after the gala, to bring beauty not to the spotlight but to the hands of those who needed it most. "Sir, what's this flower called?" a curly-haired girl asked Ethan, pointing to a pot of deep purple. "Lavender." He crouched beside her, his voice soft. "That's lavender. People say it helps calm worries." Then he glanced toward Lila, eyes warm. "Kind of like the girl who planted it." Lila laughed, a sound no longer hidden behind petals but whole and radiant. She walked over to a table where her younger brother, now an environmental science student, was showing kids how to grow herbs in recycled bottles. He looked up at her, eyes glowing with pride. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think you'd work alone forever, but you've done more than I ever imagined. I think you're really blooming now." She didn't reply, just squeezed his hand gently. Around her, children ran with flower baskets. Neighbors chatted, soft acoustic music drifted from the corner of the park. Never in her life had she imagined being the heart of something like this, not by standing out, but by building something that mattered. Ethan approached, holding out a cup of chamomile tea. I've built a lot of foundations, he said, voice low. Planned dozens of events, but nowhere's ever felt this real. She tilted her head, eyes bright. That's because this time you didn't build with your name, she said. You built with your heart. He smiled. We built it with petals, but it'll grow from the roots. The words settled between them like a quiet ending to a long chapter, one that had begun with a cold, polished gala and found its way here in a garden filled with warmth. From strangers to soulmates, each step built on kindness, courage, and the quiet strength of simply showing up. As the sun began to lean west and the tables were slowly cleared, Lila returned to the flower shop. Though she'd marked the day off, the front door had been left slightly ajar. On the doorstep lay a bouquet, no card, no sender. Just a simple arrangement and a handwritten note. To the florist who changed lives. She picked it up, heart light as a newly bloomed orchid. She didn't know who had left it. Maybe someone who'd heard her speak. Maybe someone who'd been handed a flower by a child that morning. Or maybe, just maybe, it was from the one person who had once watched her quietly gather fallen petals without ever saying a word. Lila stepped inside the shop, once her hiding place, now a seedbed for hope. She set the bouquet down, opened her journal and wrote, "Today I didn't just arrange flowers, I planted hope." Outside, the spring breeze stirred the petals across the pavement, and somewhere in the city, a man was thinking of her, not as the girl behind the counter, but as the one who had taught his heart to bloom again. Thank you for walking with us to the end of this story, where the softest things are finally allowed to speak. If you've ever felt too small to make something beautiful, remember. 1. Flower is enough to light an entire room. Like and subscribe for more stories of quiet healing and honest hearts, because somewhere in the next chapter, it might just be you being seen. Silence. Every eye turned toward her. The girl who smiled, who brewed quietly in the background, who never said much beyond, "Would you like extra sugar?" She dipped her head slightly, but her voice stayed clear. I think we could create a space where there are poetry readings, or where art students can hang their work. Maybe a corner where someone can sit, not order anything, just read. Or a little anonymous box for people to write down what they're carrying. She paused, her hand resting gently on the notebook. Maybe they'll come back, not for the coffee, but for that feeling. The feeling that it's okay to just be here. No one needing you to be happy or clever or impressive. Lucas said nothing, but something in his expression softened. Clara hadn't used business terms, no flowcharts, no market analysis, just fragments of emotion, raw, lived in, drawn from the quiet spaces she walked through every day. After the meeting, people filtered out. Clara tried to slip away, but Lucas came toward her. No grand gestures. "Clara." She turned. He wasn't smiling, but his head tilted slightly, as though listening for a breath. "I need someone who understands this place. Not from numbers, from the inside. Do you have time to work with me on this? I think we can start with what you just said." She blinked. "What do you need me to do?" "Just be you," Lucas replied. "And finish the thought." "You didn't have time to finish this morning." Clara didn't know how to answer. She nodded, and barely, and something unfamiliar rose in her chest. Not exactly joy, and more like standing at the edge of a cliff, wind curling around her, and someone reaching out a hand. That night, she came home late. Her mother was already asleep, the bedroom light dim. Clara set her bag on the worn kitchen table and pulled out the leather-bound notebook she hadn't touched in months. She opened to the first page. The pen hovered. Then she began to write, ideas for a space that feels alive, tied to people, unforced, no, brand needed. The words appeared like breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands trembled a little, but her eyes were bright. Not because she knew she'd succeed, but because for the first time she felt needed. Not to pour coffee, but to say something no one else could say. Belief doesn't arrive like lightning. It blooms like lavender, slow, gentle, and by the time you notice, it's already there. Clara had spoken, not to be heard, but because something inside her finally refused to stay quiet. And you, have you ever had a moment where you had to speak up, even while your heart trembled. Share it in the comments, and stay close because soon Clara will have to stand in the light of every eye in the room, with only her voice and one reason strong enough not to look away. The sky had yet to fully lighten when Clara stepped out of her small apartment at the end of a street lined with elms, their branches bare and brittle in the cold. Denver's sky was sheathed in a wet, grey hush. The rain didn't fall in, drops but hung in the air like a breath, so fine it only made itself known when it gathered on a sleeve. She walked, bag slung over one shoulder, clutching a worn scarf embroidered with faded words, warm hands, kind heart. Her mother had knitted. The winter she began chemotherapy. Clara had never once forgotten it, even though that winter had passed nearly 3 times over now. The cafe sat quietly on a corner. No blaring music, no neon signs. Just an old glass window with warm light spilling through like a whispered invitation. Inside, Clara flicked on the lights, wiped down each table with care, straightened the sugar jars, and placed a small vase on the wooden counter. In it, a few dried sprigs of lavender. She didn't have to do that. No one had taught her to decorate with flowers, but Clara believed scent was the first thing that held onto a person's mind, something that could soften even the worst kind of morning. The bell above the door chimed as she stood behind the counter, her earth-toned apron marked with yesterday's espresso. A man stepped in. Brown hair, charcoal wool coat, eyes sharp but dulled by fatigue. Clara guessed. Business? The kind who wandered into a cafe only because it was close to a meeting. "Good morning," he said. His voice was like a piano key pressed between 2 notes, clear but not quite decisive. Clara nodded. "Hi. What can I get for you?" "Just coffee. Black. No sugar." He didn't look at her when he said it. She tapped it into the register, already storing it in memory. Black, no sugar. But as she turned away, she paused for a breath. Something in the man's eyes, even just in passing, stirred a strange familiarity, like a face glimpsed in an old dream. When the coffee was set down, the name Lucas peeked out from the folder on the table as he reached for his laptop, but his sleeve caught the cup's edge. The dark liquid spilled in a wide arc. Across his crisp white shirt, blooming into a stain like a crushed moth. "Shit," he muttered, jerking back his chair. Clara said nothing. She moved quickly, so swiftly her footsteps made no sound. A moment later, she returned with a clean cloth, a few ice cubes wrapped in soft cotton, and a small bottle of white vinegar, the same tools she used to clean her mother's clothes. After a tremor sent soup flying from a spoon. "Hold still," she said quietly, kneeling beside the table. Lucas opened his mouth to speak, then thought better of it. She didn't look at him, just bent forward, dabbing the stain with measured care. Her hands were steady, though he was close enough to feel her breath. A hush settled around her, a kind of quiet that slowed everything down, each movement deliberate, precise. Lucas watched her like a puzzle he couldn't solve, this small woman in a forgotten corner of the city, saving something he'd already given up on. Not because she had to, but because it was simply the right thing to do. "Done," Clara murmured. "You'll want to dab it again later." He nodded, a beat slower than before. When their eyes met as she stood, he saw something deeper than gratitude, the quiet of someone used to enduring, but not embittered by it. "Let me remake your coffee," she said. "Stronger blend. You look like you need it." Lucas let out a faint laugh, his first that day. She turned away, and in that small, unremarkable gesture, he realized this wasn't just another barista. This was someone who knew a cup of coffee could be more than caffeine. It could say, "I see you," even when you don't say a word. She placed the fresh cup in front of him, the aroma darker, the finish lingering. He took a sip. His heartbeat slowed, not because of the caffeine, but because of the way everything here was held together, like someone believed even the smallest things deserved attention. "Thanks," he said, eyes lingering on her face a moment longer. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. When Lucas stepped outside, the rain was still falling, barely. He paused by the window, longer than he meant to. Through the blurred glass, he saw Clara leaning over, tidying the days. Newspapers. He couldn't say why, but he felt the tug to return, not for the coffee, for her, for the strange and quiet pull of someone who made you feel, even without asking, that it was okay to stay. Rumors began the way rain often does, not with thunder but with a strange suspended silence in the air. Clara heard it from Amy, the afternoon waitress, while slicing banana bread the next morning. "The owner's looking for investors," Amy whispered, as though speaking it aloud might make the news more real. "If no one puts up money, the cafe will close before Christmas." Clara paused, knife resting on the cutting board. For a few seconds there was no sound but the wind hissing faintly beyond the window panes. The cafe, its wooden sign etched with marrow and mirth, wasn't just a workplace. It was a second home, a second heartbeat she carried beyond. The apartment with the oxygen machine's soft pulse. "Where's the owner?" Clara asked quietly. Amy shrugged. "Said he had a private meeting this morning with a potential investor. Anyone who wants to stay and listen can." Clara hadn't planned to. She preferred to stay invisible, and meetings like these always made her feel smaller than usual. But today her hands didn't reach for her apron strings. Something held her in place. Not curiosity. Something closer to intuition. At 10, the tables were cleared in the back. A few employees lingered, notebooks in hand for show. Clara slipped into a seat in the last row, quiet, her gaze low. A smear of flour still clung to her fingers. The back door opened. The owner's voice came first. "Thanks for staying. I'd like to introduce Lucas Bell, our potential investor." Clara looked up. The room, though small, seemed to stretch taut with something unspeakable. A name might mean nothing, but a face can't be mistaken. Lucas, the man in the coffee-stained white shirt from the morning before, the one with the eyes that seemed to assess every space before stepping into it, stood less than 2 meters away. Wore a suit today. Not flashy, the kind tailored so precisely it made you forget he was dressed up at all. A pale blue shirt, no tie, but his eyes hadn't changed. Still sharp, still knowing. Lucas surveyed the room, smiling only faintly. His voice was low, clipped. "I'm not here to change everything. I just want to know if this place deserves to keep living." It wasn't a threat, but it dropped into the room like a stone into still water. The owner laid out the numbers. Profits down, rent up, foot traffic thinning. Lucas said nothing. He didn't take notes or nod along. He just looked. His gaze moved slowly, deliberately from one person to the next, as though weighing which of them still believed in this place. When his eyes landed on Clara, they stayed. A moment longer than they should have. She felt it not just in the glance but in her own heartbeat, quick then faltering. She didn't know what to do. Looking away felt rude. Meeting his gaze felt too intimate. She chose to look down, as if reviewing her notes, but her fingers clenched the corner of her notebook and her lips trembled slightly. After the meeting, people drifted off. Lucas remained a moment, speaking softly with the owner. Clara retreated behind the counter, fussing with cups and dishes. Though her movements were clumsy, off rhythm, she didn't know why she felt seen. Not in the usual sense. Seen as if that man, the one who could sign away this cafe's future, had glimpsed something in her she hadn't even noticed herself. Lucas passed the counter on his way out. He paused for exactly 1 second. He didn't speak, just looked at her and those same eyes and smiled softly. Barely there. Clara looked up just as he turned away. And in that flicker of a moment, she felt something she'd never let herself believe. Maybe she wasn't invisible. As the door clicked shut, Clara stood still. The wind stirred the pot of dried lavender on the counter. She watched his silhouette disappear beyond the window. Her hand remained on the table. Her heart still thudded. Fast, and for the first time in months she didn't know if it was from worry or the beginning of something else entirely. Team meetings were never something Clara looked forward to. That morning, when the cafe owner messaged the staff inviting them to a strategy session with the investor, She'd almost declined, partly because of her shift schedule, but mostly because she didn't believe she had anything to offer. Clara had always stayed in the background, not because she didn't understand things, but because she never thought what she had to say mattered. Her strengths lived in her hands, brewing coffee, polishing glass, aligning chairs just so. Words. She'd always assumed they belonged to someone else. But for some reason, maybe it was Lucas's eyes the day before, or the quiet dread that if she stayed silent, this place might truly disappear. She showed up. The makeshift meeting room had been set up in the back corner of the cafe, where acoustic nights used to echo once in a while. Wooden chairs arranged in a circle. Clara chose the one nearest. The fire exit, out of the way but close enough to hear every word. Lucas arrived a few minutes late. He was dressed simply, olive shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, but his gaze was the same, calm, perceptive, and every so often brushing against Clara's in a way that made her look away too fast. The owner started things off, talking about the old model, what wasn't working anymore. We need a new menu, promotions, a more modern vibe. A barista suggested adding trendy drinks from social media. Another proposed rebranding. New logo, better website, someone to run digital ads. Clara stayed silent, jotting notes. In her journal, though no one had asked, "We want to stand out, right?" Someone said. "Then we need to look the part. We need to feel modern." Lucas didn't interrupt. He didn't take notes. He listened the way people sometimes pray and with their entire body. Another voice chimed in. "We should hang up celebrity photos. People love a bit of fame." That's when Clara looked up. Something inside her shifted, like the final drop before the glass spills. She didn't raise her hand. She just spoke, her voice steady enough that it stilled the room. "I think a cafe doesn't need to stand out to survive. It just needs to make people feel like they belong." Silence. Every eye turned toward her. The girl who smiled, who brewed quietly in the background, who never said much beyond, "Would you like extra sugar?" She dipped her head slightly, but her voice stayed clear. "I think we could create a space where there are poetry readings, or where art students can hang their work. Maybe a corner where someone can sit, not order anything, just read, or a little anonymous box for people to write down what they're carrying." She paused, her hand resting gently on the notebook. Maybe they'll come back, not for the coffee, but for that feeling. The feeling that it's okay to just be here, no one needing you to be happy or clever or impressive. Lucas said nothing, but something in his expression softened. Clara hadn't used business terms, no flowcharts, no market analysis, just fragments of emotion, raw, lived in, drawn from the quiet spaces she walked through every day. After the meeting, people filtered out. Clara tried to slip away, but Lucas came toward her. No grand gestures. "Clara." She turned. He wasn't smiling, but his head tilted slightly, as though listening for a breath. "I need someone who understands this place. Not from numbers, from the inside. Do you have time to work with me on this? I think we can start with what you just said." She blinked. "What do you need me to do?" "Just be you," Lucas replied. "And finish the thought. You didn't have time to finish this morning." Clara didn't know how to answer. She nodded unbarely, and something unfamiliar rose in her chest. Not exactly joy, more like standing at the edge of a cliff, wind curling around her, and someone reaching out a hand. That night, she came home late. Her mother was already asleep, the bedroom light dim. Clara set her bag on the worn kitchen table and pulled out the leather-bound notebook she hadn't touched in months. She opened to the first page. The pen hovered. Then she began to write. Ideas for a space that feels alive, tied to people. Unforced. No. Brand needed. The words appeared like breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands trembled a little, but her eyes were bright. Not because she knew she'd succeed, but because for the first time she felt needed. Not to pour coffee, but to say something no one else could say. Belief doesn't arrive like lightning. It blooms like lavender, slow, gentle, and by the time you notice, it's already there. Clara had spoken, not to be heard, but because something inside her finally refused to stay quiet. And you? Have you ever had a moment where you had to speak up even while your heart trembled? Share it in the comments and stay close, because soon Clara will have to stand in the light of every eye in the room with only her voice and one reason strong enough not to look away. Not everyone understands the power of a song played in the late hours of the day. Clara did. Not because she studied music or ever sang in front of a crowd, but because she had once watched her mother's eyes light up at the sound of a melody from an old radio. On days she couldn't sit up, couldn't speak, yet still managed to smile when the first notes of her favorite song floated into the room. Clara had learned that some things can't be healed by medicine. Some wounds can only be soothed by music, by memory, by the quiet endurance of beauty. That's why she proposed the first acoustic night. The idea had started as a scribbled note in her journal. Music. Every Friday. No stage. Just warm light, wooden chairs, and real people. She hadn't been sure Lucas would go for it, but when she handed him the draft plan, he only nodded. Let's try. But it has to feel like you. The day began with the scent of rain. Clara and Lucas arrived early. She brought strands of soft white bulb lights, the kind used at outdoor weddings. Lucas had a crate of old speakers he'd rescued from a vintage shop years ago. There was no crew, no event staff. Just the two of them, 2 pairs of hands, and the narrow patio behind the cafe, once used for storing old furniture. They strung lights from tree branches, stretched wires along the edge of the wooden awning. Lucas stood on a ladder while Clara held it steady, watching as he tested each plug. The first bulb lit just as the sky turned gold. Nothing fancy, not too bright, just enough to make the evening feel like a constellation had landed in their backyard. The sound system crackled slightly. Clara played a test song on her phone. An acoustic voice filtered through the speakers, low, gravelly, as if someone were telling a story after dinner. She looked at Lucas. He said nothing, but something in his face softened. "Do you think anyone will come?" she asked, her voice betraying a flicker of doubt. "They will," Lucas said without hesitation. She smiled, just a little. By nightfall, the wooden chairs filled the patio. On each table sat a glass jar with a flickering candle. Clara wore a fresh apron, her hair tied up. Lucas wore a light linen shirt, simple and unassuming. The first guests were an older couple. They ordered tea and said nothing. Then came small groups, students, neighbors, friends of the staff. A few street musicians showed up with guitars, harmonicas. One man carried a weathered violin. The music began without an announcement. A young man stood, guitar in hand, and said softly, "I wrote this one for my mother." Clara stood behind the counter, drying glasses as always. But when the chords began, bare, quiet, without embellishment, she stopped. The voice wasn't perfect, but something about it held the room still. Golden light, soft rain outside, and a voice that felt like a breath from the past. Clara bowed her head, polishing the rim of a glass. But her fingers paused at a single droplet sliding to the bottom. Not condensation, but a tear escaping her eye. Lucas saw. He stood near the entrance, never pushing forward. He saw the way her shoulders curved, the way her hand gripped. The counter, like she was holding something fragile, something almost too full to carry. He didn't speak, didn't move closer. Just stood quietly witnessing the quiet bloom of a soul learning how to breathe again. When the song ended, the applause was gentle, more exhale than ovation. Clara lifted her head. Her eyes shimmered, but her smile was steady. Lucas was still there. And he understood then. What pulled him wasn't just the concept or the cafe or even the music. It was her, the shy girl with neatly tied hair and hands always in motion, the one who had somehow created a space where people felt safe and seen. As the next melody drifted through the evening, Lucas knew he hadn't come here to invest in a coffee shop. He had come to rediscover something he'd lost long ago, the feeling of connection without explanation. The performance had long ended. Most of the guests were gone. Only a few unwashed cups remained, a few streaks of water on the tables, and the muted golden glow of string lights bleeding through misted windows. Outside, the rain had stopped. But it lingered in the air like a whisper that hadn't quite finished. Clara moved quietly, gathering crumpled drink coasters. Lucas was unhooking the lights, unscrewing each bulb, and laying them gently into a box. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They were wrapped in the hush that follows something beautiful, an after stillness that felt almost sacred. On the wooden floor, the neon light cast long reflections. Each step echoed softly. The creak of boards, the hush of a broom, the familiar quiet of two people accustomed to solitude. Lucas sank into a wooden chair near the counter, no longer looking like an investor. His shirt was rumpled, sleeves pushed to his elbows. He watched Clara wiping down the counter, her eyes still red from the evening, her face composed. "You ever hear the saying, 'The quietest people see the most'?" he asked, his voice light, as if he wasn't really expecting an answer. Clara paused, not turning around. "No," she said, "but it sounds true." Lucas smiled faintly. He lowered his gaze, threading his fingers together. "I once slept in my car for a year." She turned this time. Her eyes widened, not from shock, but from something gentler. Curiosity, really. Her voice was barely above a whisper. He nodded, still looking down. "Quit my job, poured everything I had into my first project. It collapsed in 4 months. I lost everything, money, apartment. All I had left was a beat-up car and a few books. I parked near the public library, read by the headlights." Clara didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions. She simply crossed the room and sat across from him, still holding the cleaning cloth like a talisman. Something small and safe. "There was a point I thought I'd never get back up again. And the worst part wasn't being broke. It was starting to believe I didn't deserve to dream anymore." Clara looked down, her hand tightening slightly around the edge of the towel. "I understand," she said after a long pause. "Yeah." Lucas lifted his eyes to hers. "I've never slept in a car," she said with a soft laugh that barely disguised the emotion behind it. "But I live in a tiny house where the only person I care about is fading a little more every day." Lucas didn't flinch. He met her gaze without pity, only presence. "My mom has cancer," Clara continued. "Stage 4 I work here to help pay her bills. Every morning I leave the house, I lock the door so gently it barely clicks. And every night when I come back, I'm afraid to open it, afraid it'll be the day I lose her." She didn't cry, but her voice broke in places, like glass cracking beneath too much pressure. Quiet but unmistakably sharp. "I've never dreamed bigger than a good cup of coffee," she said. "Just hot enough, just smooth enough, just kind enough that someone might want to come back." I thought maybe that was enough. Lucas didn't answer right away. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. The corners were worn, no title, no author's name, no pictures. Just a slim journal with frayed edges. "I wrote this while living in my car," he said, offering it to her. "It's for the people no one hears." Clara took it. She opened to the first page. In tiny print, it read, "This book is for those who quietly dream." A tear fell, sudden, silent, not out of sadness but recognition. The kind of tear that comes when someone for the first time reaches for your hand in the dark and finds it. Lucas didn't move closer. He didn't touch her. He just sat there, steady and still, knowing that in moments like these what we need most isn't advice. It's someone who stays. Rain seeped softly into the wooden walls. Two people sat across from each other, like mismatched notes in the same song, different in tone but exactly where they belonged. That night they didn't say anything more. And they didn't have to. The living room was dark, lit only by the soft glow of a nightlight in the corner, casting Clara's shadow in long, gentle waves across the ceiling. Her eyes were wide open, her fingers clenched tight around the edge of the bedsheet. Another sleepless night. The alarm clock read 2:13 a.m. Outside the window, a distant car horn rose and faded. Wind hissed faintly through the glass. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, but the image returned, clearer than ever. That meeting room, 20 pairs of eyes and her in the center, expected to speak. A day earlier, the cafe owner had made the announcement. "Clara, we'd like you to represent the team in the presentation to the associate investors. You understand this vision best." Her heart had dropped straight to the floor. She had wanted to refuse, had almost said no. But Lucas had looked at her, not with pressure, not with challenge, but with a quiet kind of faith. And that, more than anything, had made her stay. Since then, each night had been a battle. She rewrote her speech 10 times, deleted 9, practiced in the mirror, but her voice broke after a few lines. Clara wasn't afraid of failing. She was afraid of being seen, of being measured, of being found. Not enough. On the morning of the presentation, she arrived early, arms wrapped around a stack of printed notes. Her eyes were ringed with shadows. Her lip was raw from biting. She stepped into the meeting room and saw the upholstered chairs, the clip-on mics, the projection screen glowing behind the podium. Her chest tightened. The air was too thick. She stood in the middle of the room, her palms freezing. An hour before the meeting, Clara slipped out. She walked quickly down the hallway, all the way to the emergency stairwell. Her hand reached for the exit handle, clear intent. Run. Escape. But then a low voice called from behind. "Clara." She turned. Lucas stood there, calm, unhurried. He said nothing, just held out a small folded piece of paper. She opened it. In blue ink, handwritten, "The only failure is never showing up." Clara stared at the words. She didn't speak, but her fingers curled around the note, and instead of turning away, she turned back toward the room. Standing behind the microphone, she felt like she was dreaming. The stage lights burned hot on her face. Her heart pounded wildly. Her hands trembled, her mouth was dry. She opened the first slide. No one spoke, but the weight of their gaze sliced through her. "Good morning," she said, her voice hoarse. "I'm Clara. I've worked at the cafe for 4 years, and I've never presented in front of anyone before." A few people chuckled softly. She bit her lip, then looked at her notes. But instead of reading line by line, she looked up, met their eyes. "I don't have a business degree. I'm not a designer. I don't know how to run ads, but I know why people come to our cafe." The room grew still. Some people come because they need a place to sit quietly, without being asked too many questions. Some come for the cappuccino, with the little heart the barista draws each morning. Some come every Tuesday, because their wife passed away on a Tuesday. She paused. Her heartbeat still thundered in her chest, but her voice was steadier now. "I don't have a beautiful reason to save this place, except that it's one of the few spaces left where people still feel seen." Silence stretched. No. One moved. Clara looked down at her hands, then up at the screen, where an image from the acoustic night filled the wall behind her. Smiling faces, warm lights, hands folded gently together. "We don't need a flashy place to call home. Just a small corner where strangers can sit beside each other and listen to a song in silence." She stopped there. No closing slide, no rehearsed finale. For a moment, the room remained completely still. No applause, no smiles. Then one person stood, then another. Applause followed, slow, rising like a tide. Someone nodded. Someone wiped away tears. Clara didn't beam. She didn't bow. But her eyes were bright, brighter than ever before. She had stood up, not to be perfect, but to be real. And for the first time in her life, her voice didn't disappear into silence. That morning, Clara arrived at the cafe earlier than usual. Not because there was too much to do. She simply didn't know how to move through the world with this new feeling. Recognition, pinned to the staff bulletin board behind the counter, was a printed notice in bold announcement. Clara officially appointed as cafe manager. She stared at the words as if they belonged to someone else. She didn't know what to feel, joy, fear, or just plain disbelief. When she stepped into the bar station, her co-workers clapped. Amy brought in a tray of cinnamon rolls, a tiny candle flickering in the center. "Not a birthday," Amy grinned, "but it is the first time this cafe has had a manager who cried during a presentation." Clara blushed but didn't lower her head. She thanked each of them, hands trembling slightly as she cut the pastry. It all felt like a dream, but this time she didn't want to wake up. Customers arrived earlier than usual. An elderly woman gave Clara a box of tea. A college student handed her a small handwritten card. "Thank you for keeping this place alive." Every word, every glance felt like a small stone laid on the foundation Clara had once feared she was too weak to hold. But now, stone by stone, it felt solid beneath her. By afternoon, sunlight spilled gold through the windows. Clara was reviewing the books when Lucas walked in, quiet as always, without announcement. He wore a light jacket, his hair tousled by the wind, but his eyes were softer than usual. "Take a walk with me," he said, hands in his pockets. Clara nodded, untied her apron and followed him onto the front porch of the cafe. They stood by the wooden railing, watching people drift past on the street. Neither of them spoke for a few minutes. A breeze passed through, carrying the scent of warm pastries and freshly brewed coffee. Lucas leaned back against the railing, head tilted toward her. "Clara," he said. His voice didn't sound like it did in meetings. It sounded like someone who had finally set something heavy down. "I know you think I came here for profit." She glanced at him but didn't deny it. "And you'd be right," he went on. "At first, but after that first morning, I realized I wasn't here to calculate anything. I was here because I needed a new reason to believe in people." Clara said nothing, her eyes following the sunlight stretching across the wooden floorboards. "I didn't invest in numbers," Lucas said more slowly now. "I invested in you." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't romantic, and it didn't need a soundtrack. But it rang through Clara like the first sound after a long silence. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. She simply looked at him for a long moment and then smiled. For the first time, the smile wasn't hidden, wasn't cautious, wasn't turned downward. It was the smile of someone who once believed she was only the shadow behind the counter, now realizing that light can come from the quietest place. And Lucas, seeing that light, didn't need any other reason to stay. Late summer. The wind still carried a hint of warmth, but the evening light had already begun to whisper of fall. Clara stood inside the cafe, smoothing the tablecloth for the third time. Outside, the golden string lights hung like threads of memory stretched across time. She didn't know why her hands were trembling, whether it was nerves or because tonight marked the end of something, the final music night of the summer. So of a program she once hadn't dared to believe would work, and maybe the close of a chapter in her life. The cafe had filled early. No invitations were needed. Everyone brought something: an old guitar, a jar of flowers, a book, a long-held hug. It didn't feel like a party. It felt like a reunion after a year apart. Clara moved slowly through the courtyard, each step retracing memories. That chair, where the old man once sat reading the paper. That table in the corner where a mother and daughter had laughed over a spilled cup of cocoa. And the center, where she had stood during the first music night, hands shaking, heart pounding. Lucas stood by the window, white shirt untucked, no tie, a cup of black coffee in his hand. He didn't approach. He just watched her for a long, quiet moment. Then, as though the lights themselves took a breath, the MC's voice rang out. Clara, who made this place a home for so many, would like to share a small something. Before we close. Clara stood still. She hadn't prepared anything. No speech. No plan. But she walked forward, not because anyone asked her to, but because her heart whispered, "It's time." She sat down at the piano. Her fingers rested gently on the keys. It was a wordless piece she had once played on a quiet afternoon, filled with the scent of lavender and the sound of her mother's fading breath. But tonight, it wasn't for comfort. It was to share. The music began. Each note fell like late sunlight, unhurried, undramatic, seeping gently into the quiet cracks people kept hidden. The room stilled. A child stopped chewing her cookie. A man closed his book. A woman let tears fall without knowing why. Lucas stepped forward. He didn't push through the crowd and didn't speak, just stood behind her. One hand rested lightly on her shoulder. the shoulder of someone who had carried too much for too long without realizing she was tired. Clara didn't look up, but her face glowed like a candle, eyes blurred not with weakness, but with the simple truth of finally feeling without hiding. When the song ended, there was no applause, just silence, the kind that feels holy. Lucas leaned down and whispered, "Stay." One word. "Enough." Clara turned to him. Not quickly. Not with surprise. As if she had always known it would come. As if she had been waiting for it her whole life. She looked into his eyes. Didn't look away, didn't lower her gaze. She was fully there, present, brave, and at peace. And then she answered, "I already am. Even before you asked." There. Eyes met, not to confirm but to remember. We stay not because someone holds us, we stay because we've found where we belong. There was no embrace. No kiss. Just Clara at the piano, Lucas beside her and the golden light casting their faces in soft, steady glow, like two quiet stars finding each other in a galaxy without words. Thank you for staying until the end of this story, and if there's ever a moment when you feel too small for the rush of this world, remember, sometimes a single whisper is all it takes to change the course of someone's life. If this story touched something in your heart, leave a like or a follow, not just for me, but so that moments like this, soft and luminous, can find their way to someone else, because maybe you are the reason someone still believes in the kindness of tomorrow.